Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Human Element. Today I'm speaking with Jeremy Turner, VP of Threat Intelligence and Research at SecurityScorecard. Jeremy, thanks for joining me today.
Glad to join you. Happy to be here.
So would you start off by telling us a little bit about your journey thus far?
Yeah, so I started off my security career like many folks did, and kind of just exploring networks and trying to figure out how to add functionality to certain games. And this is kind of back in the '90s when things were really still the Wild West. Finding exploits or reverse engineering was actually a lot easier then than it is now. So I had quite a bit of fun. I got completely hooked, and somehow that turned into a career field, in the later part of the '90s. But I was just completely addicted to reverse engineering, exploring networks. There's this whole new domain of knowledge that emerged, and I just wanted to be a part of it. I spent the majority of my career in threat intelligence. I really enjoy the research side of this, the kind of Sherlock Holmes kind of investigation and mapping. That's another part of this that I really enjoy. I also enjoy the kind of cat and mouse game. There's the adversary, there's somebody to work and compete against. It's competitive as a field professionally, but also there's the adversary side of this that's also really interesting and keeps things really dynamic.
They definitely keep us on our toes. I'll ask you to think about a few key life events that have shaped your leadership style. What comes to mind?
I would say the thing that's shaped my leadership style the most is the influence that different mentors have had on my career path, and also creating opportunities and presenting new challenges. I've had a chance to work with some incredible people. My career took me through the Pentagon as a defense contractor, doing computer network defense, which was eye-opening and a huge part of shaping my career. I also worked for a bunch of former CIA executives at Crumpton Group, where I felt like I was absorbing knowledge just through osmosis, and their behaviors and how they approach problems, and also their attitudes towards challenges. They had a very high risk tolerance for accepting projects that were seemingly impossible. And I really liked the opportunity to do some of those things that were really, kind of, I felt like cutting edge or uncharted territory. It's very similar to what I found attractive about the career field and cybersecurity in general in the '90s. It was this new frontier of challenges where there wasn't a lot of prior knowledge or prior processes, and it was just incredibly exciting. I think the mentors that I kind of gravitated towards were the ones that could really open the doors to those kind of challenges and opportunities, and also develop that trust where they felt that I would be able to be successful in those situations.
Was there any one mentor that had a major impact?
I would say it would be Scott Johnson, who he's retired from the Secret Service. But, his mentorship, I mean, he was very open, very trusting, and, just provided a really good basis to develop the sense of loyalty and the kind of currency that is in the industry. When things are going to get tough, things will be challenging, and, every outcome's not going to be a huge win. Sometimes there's going to be failures, but, he was unfazed by the failures, that I had, because if you're trying hard stuff, you're not going to succeed every time. And, he was one of the people that really stuck with me and continued to push me, and regardless of outcomes, expected better. And I feel that a lot of us in the industry kind of get sucked into that vacuum. And if you want to grow, that's where you need to be. You need to be challenged, and you need to be failing. And if you're not failing, then you're probably not pushing yourself hard enough or taking on challenges that are big enough.
All right, so let's talk about some of those failures. Any particular mistakes that led to something significant?
I think one of the failures that kind of sticks out in my mind was in the consulting world. And it was really just not understanding the customer's objective and actually not understanding the customer's company culture well enough. So whenever you're making recommendations, you have to kind of bounce these off yourself, but really kind of put yourself in character as your customer and understand the different cultural sensitivities. I think a lot of these things that I was doing internationally, it's not just the technical work that's important, but you really have to understand the organizational and the cultural side of any kind of business or even a government operation. There's going to be different appetites for different things, and even giving advice, although it may be right, might not be the right advice to give. I think that a lot of the failures I've had were having a disconnect between understanding my customers' goals, their culture, and their objectives. And, I've definitely offended some customers by being a little bit too verbose or lacking tact, I would say. And I think that as a technical community, we tend to communicate with each other as a matter of fact, when there's a vulnerability, when there's a security failure. But that's not really how the world operates outside the technical space. And you put things in writing, those can have long-term business impact or assignment of liability. And even though, you're right, you may be wrong in how the information is presented. And that's kind of one of the things that, over the course of my career, I've had to check myself on several times. And usually the feedback from the customers is pretty direct if they're not happy with how it's being presented. But I would say consistently that's a theme that I've failed. It's really failing to understand the customer and the business and the culture. And I think that those are things that we can all, if we have that extra voice in the back of our mind, it's really helpful, and we'll be much more successful if we keep those things relevant.
So you mean technical accuracy isn't the only thing that matters?
Yeah, it's shocking. I know. It was shocking to me the first time I got some feedback about presenting some things that I was really excited about. Hey, this awesome vulnerability, but they didn't think it was so awesome.
They weren't so keen on it.
Not so keen on it, and it really had nothing to do with the technical facts. It was really just how my messaging was around it. And I would say that's something that, from making those mistakes, I've been able to gain that extra voice in my mind and put myself in their position in how I'm communicating, receiving, writing, speaking. I think it's really important to keep it couched in the customer's minds.
Definitely. Are there non-technical skills that have been critical in your growth?
Yeah, the non-technical skills, one was the ability to do storytelling. I discounted this as, just fluff. And, you know, I think that was one of the things that slowed me down in my career. If you can't get people engaged and interested in what you're trying to communicate, if you can't tell a story with the data, you're going to lose people. In my time at the Pentagon, there was I can't say the exact language because it's pretty colorful. If you can imagine what you'd get from an officer in the military, essentially they were saying like, look, this technical data is great, but like, what am I supposed to do with this? How am I supposed to communicate this? And that was essentially, where I started learning that you need to have a story. And if you can't provide anecdotal scenarios, or you can't narrate this in simpler terms of, good guys and bad guys, cops versus robbers, you're going to lose people in the audience. But also, if you don't do that, you're losing the effectiveness of the message, and inherently your intelligence, even though it's awesome, is going to be less valuable if you can't really narrate that and frame it in the right context.
The recipient of your message has to be able to understand it and take away the same message. Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned failure a little while ago, and that seems to be, I grew up in a similar era where this wasn't an industry. It was just the thing the networking dudes usually did. But like, any memorable failures that led into personal growth?
There's so many. I think that accepting failure is hard. All our egos get bruised when we fail. And, I think it's very easy to become failure averse. But especially in the cybersecurity industry, if you're not, failing and failing often, you're really not pushing the envelope. I think that there's the pervasive motto in the offensive security community, like try harder. And even in how we determine adversaries, like advanced threat, it's not advanced threat, it's persistent threat. And really, persistence is the more important part of that. Over time, opportunities will present themselves. The adversaries know this. They know if they just keep monitoring infrastructure, there's going to be a configuration change. It's not even going to require some crazy exploit. They can just find an open directory.
Wait for us to screw up. And
Exactly. And I think that's the thing to underscore. It's the field is very challenging, especially if you're really pushing yourself. And persistence is the key. I mean, the most dangerous adversaries out there aren't the ones that are, developing crazy, complicated exploit chains, because those are going to be difficult to pull off. They're going to be very specific in their application. They're going to be very costly and time intensive to develop. And so that's not really where the biggest threats are. The biggest threats are really from the adversaries that are not going to be deterred by failure. And I think that professionally, we need to embody that as well, and just accept that, things are going to be hard. We're not always going to be successful, but you just have to erase those failures from your memory as far as your ego goes, and, take them as lessons learned. I don't think there's anything more important than how we handle failures. And if you maintain the mindset that you're an adversary and you're just going to continue to do this until you're successful, that's the name of the game.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about it all the time where, you know, we have to be right all the time. They only have to be right once. As human beings, we're never going to be right all of the time. You just have to embrace it and run with it.
The combination of persistence and initiative is really the greatest criteria for success. And when I'm looking at new team members, those are the two qualities that I'm really most interested in, because anybody with those qualities can be successful in this field, especially with good advice, mentoring, and also, the trust and faith to give them the challenges that'll help them get there.
And the confidence to deal with failure.
Exactly.
How do you screen for those?
Usually just asking questions like you've just been asking. I think some of the most memorable moments in our careers are going to be failures. And I think that the best measure of our trajectory in our career is how we handle those failures. And there's probably nothing more telling than somebody who can get excited about, oh, this time I messed this up really good, but I learned this. Those are the winning qualities.
What's your approach to building teams and building trust in those teams?
Yeah, the most important team building process, I think, is really that ability to communicate. So when we're telling stories, when we're sharing information, it's really complicated working remote to kind of build that kind of team camaraderie. I mean, working in a knock or in a suite where you're forced into a same space, there's a lot of knowledge transfer just by being in the same atmosphere or in the same kind of command climate. It's really, working with peers, hearing how they're communicating when they're speaking about issues, when they're asking questions. There's a lot of value in that kind of tacit knowledge transfer and that knowledge exchange just by being immersed in those environments. The same way you would learn a language, immersion is the way. The same way that we can maintain that kind of team alignment and command climate is really through that immersive process. Working remote, that takes a lot more effort. There has to be specific exercises, common training, good communication processes, good documentation processes. Looking for folks that are inclined or biased towards communicating and asking questions, especially in a remote environment, is very important. As part of any interview process, you can kind of get a sense of that, of how inquisitive they are, how engaging they are, and then also just kind of even their own personal feedback of like, do they prefer to be an IC? Do they like to work in isolation? This industry also has a lot of phenomenal folks that do not, fit into teams.
Don't work and play well with others? Yeah.
Exactly. I say that the communication is the most important, but really it's I think having confidence and consistency in their mode of operation and in their method of communication, whether that's one-on-one as an IC, whether that's part of a team member, there's no perfect fit for personalities or culture. I think it just really takes a lot of rigorous thought process into how you structure teams and make sure that you're putting people in the right roles, as much as, having, those common team alignment goals and good communication.
Have any special tools for running remote teams and kind of specific meetings or process?
We all live in the Slack world. I think that the most important thing there is to find different ways that the team can engage on common interests that are not just work related, to start building a, kind of a pattern or a behavior where, people are more likely to communicate with each other, even if it's not specifically about work stuff. There's a lot of times that, if you're working on a hard problem, sometimes changing context or changing the conversation or helping somebody else work on a problem can be insightful. Also teaching and encouraging other teams to present their findings or teach us something. There's also an incredible amount of value in learning by framing yourself in the context of a teacher. You can, if you have to communicate this to somebody else, if you have to transfer this skill or knowledge, just the thought process of how you're going to do that and how you're going to present that so that others see value in it can often improve your own processes and work quality as well.
Goes right back to the storytelling.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we spend a lot of time dealing with new information and knowledge coming at us pretty much constantly, as well as, administrative workload, things like that. What's your strategy for balancing the technical expertise you need to be effective with the leadership and, functional operations that you need to run a good team?
Yeah, I think the most important thing there is just to be comfortable with chaos. We have to accept that we're not going to be able to handle everything, but it's like the important things will come at you, and you will know like which things to focus on. Some things are going to hit the floor. If you feel like you're handling everything and nothing's hitting the floor, then there's probably a problem there, because there's way too much in this industry. I mean, it is many miles wide and an inch deep at the top level, and then if you get down into like a vertical specific knowledge, it is very deep.
10 miles deep and half an inch wide. Yeah.
Exactly. So, nobody is ever going to be a domain expert in everything in cyber, and we all just have to be comfortable that there's a lot that we don't know, but also identify what we don't know, to lean on others' expertise, and also just be comfortable in accepting that I'm not going to understand everything. You read through a new exploit, or you're looking at a specific vulnerability. There's going to be a lot of different parts of that you're not going to accept. But it's really it comes back to more of the persistence. It's like, okay, well, just accept the things that you don't understand. Focus on the things that you do, and see where those things round out. When you're working towards a solution. The amount of news and the volume of change in the industry, especially now where we have like a whole new attack surface with AI and MCP, all these other things that are going on. The landscape's constantly changing, and just understanding that that's okay. And it's okay to not do everything or understand everything. And, kind of like those characters in the movie, as they're moving through the battlefield and all the stuff's going off around them, having that kind of acceptance that, this is a crazy situation. There's a lot of stuff going on, but I'm going to focus on the things that I can change. And even though it's maybe small and incremental, those incremental gains are important.
Absolutely. How do you define success for your team?
I define success for my team as really not only just our ability to meet our commitments and goals, but also the ability to exceed them. If you're meeting deadlines every quarter, then something's wrong. It's like you could say that your planning process is precise, but in reality, it's probably because you're not doing enough, or these objectives are too easy. I think it's good. Just what we were talking about, the tolerance for failure. There should never be a situation where you feel like you're meeting all objectives on time, on schedule, because you probably don't have enough. There's an endless amount of work to do in this space. And I think it's important to really push past like perfection on deliverable dates and scope, and really try to understand, okay, well, what's that extra 10% I can get? Or how can I take 10% of my time and think about not just the work that we have committed, but how we can improve this or expand the scope. I really think that that's really important to not just focus on immediate goals, but really try to stretch those.
Do you have any components of a daily routine that you find helpful?
I'm the worst person to reference routine. I, I don't have one. I think, every time I've tried to create a routine, there's something that disrupts it. And I find it very difficult to, get back on track, or there's some part of like, missing a piece, like even things like, going to the gym or running or whatever, with, managing a team, trying to be like innovate on things, and then, having a family, it kind of goes back to this chaos mentality. It's like when I guess I look at things like you have your commitments that you need to commit to, but then I also think it's really important to listen to what your mind and your personality is telling you that you want to do. There's ways to mix those things in. It's like every day you're not going to feel like going to the gym at the same time, but your objective is to do that at some point. So just kind of like finding the space to do these things, and make sure that you're taking personal time and time to work on your own projects, I think is really important. When you don't feel like switching context and you've got this tunnel vision, just keep it going. If you're frustrated or you feel like you're blocked, like do something else. I think that, for me personally, like I found I operate best with very little structure. And, if you're really committed and you're approaching problems with intensity and persistence, you'll find ways to make those things work. But, organizationally, I'm a little bit chaotic.
That's fair. Fighting chaos on a regular basis. It only makes sense. Anyone I know who starts the day with a rigid schedule tends not to have a very exciting day compared to what we see out here.
If I started every morning planning my day out, it would, maybe it's good to have an outline, but it's never going to go the way I expect it's going to go. There's always going to be some new critical vulnerability, or something's going to happen, or, there's way too many unknowns and uncertainty to really spend a lot of time and investing in a rigorous schedule and structured. I mean, structured processes are important, and I want to say it's not, but just being able to be adaptive is critical in this field. And I would say just don't get too overcommitted on schedules, deliverables, and timelines, because there's always going to be something that throws a wrench into those things. And just being able to adapt and handle it is really the better skill to develop.
How do you stay ahead of emerging threats and emerging tech?
To stay ahead of emerging threats in tech, it's really important to look at the history of things. If we want to predict future vulnerabilities and which technology products are going to have future vulnerabilities, it's a combination of different things of what adversaries have built their targeting processes around. There's a reward model there for them. So if they're successful in exploiting a certain technology, or if they've already invested, hundreds or thousands of hours collectively in discovering vulnerabilities in any given technology, they're very likely to want to build on that knowledge base and those processes to continue to develop further exploits or modify them in slight ways that bypass existing mitigations. So I would say that, as far as, being predictive or, expecting what's next, we can anticipate those things by looking at the technology products that are commonly exposed to the internet that have lots of complexity. And I won't name names, but, there's quite a few that are popping top of mind that I could confidently say there's going to be new critical RCEs next year for these 3 products. It's just a combination of the reward model for adversaries, the amount of time that they've invested into those things, and the complexity of the products is like the perfect storm for the next wave of vulnerabilities we're all going to be dealing with.
It's a cool approach. Is there one thing that you do as a leader you wish you saw other leaders doing?
I would say it's really listening. This is something I also had a hard time developing, especially if you're very opinionated and you're very excited about stuff, or you have, existing knowledge base and skills. Sometimes it's hard just to keep your mouth shut and just listen and let other people explain or finish their thoughts, or even kind of just hear themselves talk about the problem from their own perspective and try to understand them. I think it's something that I've struggled with in my career, and I wish that more leaders would just take a moment to listen. And even though whoever's speaking may not be completely correct about something, I think it's really important to hear people out and also kind of take it to heart and let that influence your own bias from your own experience and knowledge you have, and really kind of have some that process in your head that's running in a loop saying, okay, I don't agree with these things. I agree with these things. Oh, these things are interesting, Then, those interesting things are important to pull threads on and ask questions. I think that many times I've gone into situations thinking like, oh, I'm the expert on this. And then I get completely schooled by somebody, and I would have been better off keeping my mouth shut so I didn't look like an idiot.
How does that go? Better to keep your mouth closed and let people assume you're a fool than open it and remove all doubt? Something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much knowledge in this, and I think it's easy, especially if we invest a lot of time in certain domain areas. It's easy to gain that confidence and that ego that says like, oh, I really know this stuff. But a lot of these domain knowledge areas, they're not static. They're changing a lot, and new opinions and also just different perspectives, I think, are really important. We look at vulnerabilities and network exposures, and it's really often not the rigorous technical things that are the problems, it's the nuances. And there's a lot of different ways to approach solving those problems. And that's kind of really the hacker mentality, right? It's like, be creative, don't think outside the academic processes and the accepted, ways things should be done, and try to think about them differently.
And I think you find at the end of the day that every topic area has its own Dunning-Kruger curve. They're all rabbit holes, and the question is who's gone the deepest down any particular one.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's like knowing that you know nothing or something like this. I think they just have, maintaining that open mind and understanding, that there's going to be a lot of changes, and not getting too stuck in any one area where you think that, oh, I know everything about this, or I am the domain expert on this. I think it's important to go into every situation thinking like, okay, I have stuff I know about this. There's probably a lot I don't. And I think that that's a great general way to approach problems and conversations as well.
Absolutely. How do you know when a team has an effective culture, and what do you do to build it?
Effective teams have cohesion. They have focus. If we think about a cybersecurity team, whether it's offense or defense, You need to have that sharp tool. And the easiest way to, penetrate any attack surface is to have that sharp point. So if you have this focus and you have specific direction, you'll often be a lot more successful than if the team's kind of scattered all over. If the team doesn't have any kind of groups that have specific mission focus that are tailored around certain objectives, you're not going to have the impact that you need. So it really just having focus. If you need to accomplish a lot of different objectives, find a way to break those down into core competencies and, specific, mission groups that have that expertise, or at least the tasking to focus on very specific objectives. And also have the ability for those teams to say, we should change this objective. Like, we shouldn't really be going after this. We found this is more important. It really kind of goes back to being, flexible, managing the chaos, but also like you have to go into approaching problems with like very specific outcomes. And the more precise you can define the requirements or whatever it is you're specifically trying to accomplish, you're going to be much more successful in those outcomes. And if you define problems or objectives very generally or very broadly.
How do you approach difficult decisions?
Yeah, difficult decisions, I usually will have independent conversations with different people. I'll have group conversations with people. I think when we're looking at any difficult decision, especially when it comes to the team or it comes to product strategy or operational strategy, it's important to, before making mandates, it's important to actually get some consensus, whether that's, first independently and then as like specific groups, and see how those answers change over time. I think it's important to get individual opinions and perspectives, solving certain problems before, we have a team meeting, because once you get to a team meeting, you get this groupthink mentality where somebody's going to say a good idea and that's going to become the idea. I think it's important to kind of have different individual conversations and let even like junior analysts and others on the team that don't have specific domain expertise kind of weigh in on what their thoughts are. I really do like kind of getting a collective consensus before making any big changes.
What's the one piece of advice you most often give folks in the field?
For folks looking to get into the cybersecurity field or the cyber threat intelligence field, it's really, my encouragement is always around persistence, especially for folks that don't have technical backgrounds. Some folks that I started, building computers and doing all this stuff, and I gained a lot of, the tacit knowledge from those experiences where those things are just like, I don't even think about them consciously. But there's a lot of knowledge to absorb in this field. I mean, you're talking about being able to understand, the IT administration process, network configuration process. Cybersecurity requires all that knowledge. So it's going to be absolutely overwhelming. And I would say the best advice I've ever given is just understand that you're going to be completely overwhelmed by this stuff, and just get comfortable accepting it. And, just like, learning a new game. I think one of the analogies I give often is like, hey, the first time you played StarCraft, or maybe that's a outdated example now, but the first time you played StarCraft or Age of Empires, I'm sure you were absolutely overwhelmed by the possible combinations to do certain things and the order to do certain things. And the cybersecurity field is much like that. It's like you're going to be overwhelmed, but just literally start clicking on everything, start wading into every subject. Even though everything might not stick and you might not retain everything, just do your best and see also what interests you the most. This is there's a lot of very interesting domain specific fields in cybersecurity and within threat intelligence itself. So find out what you like to do, and if you focus on that stuff, it's going to be a lot easier than trying to force yourself down a career path where you're really struggling or you're not hooked on reading or learning more. Find the domain specific knowledge area that really hooks you, and really spend a lot of time on that.
Speaking of reading and learning more, any specific recommendations, books, podcasts, blogs, anything that helped you?
Things that helped me specifically were the old, I don't know if anybody's going to know about this stuff, but like these old SOTMS forms or InfoSec boards from the 90s. Also like Farvia's reverse engineering forms. Those were my learning tools. It was really not just reading white papers and the academic material, but also finding places where people are exchanging ideas and knowledge and kind of writing their own white papers. I mean, like the 2600 Frac magazine. I think specifically about Frac, like if you want to talk about storytelling, like some of the best storytelling in the industry exists in that magazine. And like there's some really old anecdotal stories that are still really fun to read. So I would say, if anybody's interested in reading something that's probably not a common reading source or material, I would say check out Frack. There's a whole host of knowledge there, and just understanding and trying to get into the story and understand, these different researchers' minds when they were kind of exploring stuff. I think it's a great mentality to kind of draw some examples from.
Awesome. What's your approach to mentoring the next generations?
My approach to mentoring is always present the challenges. You can say it's more like a Socratic method. Or I think really it also helps me determine, who I really want to invest in and invest the time. It's easy to reinforce initiative. If somebody has that initiative, if they have the passion in the field, I mean, those are the folks that I really try to invest time in, because I feel like it has a really good multiplier for both me and them. If you're not passionate about this field, you really should find another one, because it's going to be hard. And if you're in this and you feel overwhelmed and you're not hooked, it's probably going to be a bad time. So, it's like, I really encourage a lot of the folks that I'm mentoring to develop their own personal projects, whether that's like hardware hacking, doing kind of maker like stuff. But having those outlets where you don't feel like you're working, you feel like you're having fun and you're enjoying what you're doing. I mean, those are the best ways to mentor folks. It's really, not from, like, I think, in my opinion, the academic rigorous approach towards, get these certifications, read these materials, do these courses. I think it's really like, if you can inspire somebody or help them develop that sense of initiative or that passion about any kind of one specific area, like, that's really a key secret to success.
So, as we move up the ladder, there are a whole bunch of different transitions and different changes. Which step on that ladder would you say has been the hardest for you?
I think the hardest was really moving into a management role. I really enjoyed the technical challenges, and, I'm not the best person to deal with people. So, I would say that, transitioning into a management role was difficult, but I was fortunate that in a lot of my transition periods, I was working with team members that were really good and also very like-minded. Some of the early startups like Coalition, cyber insurance startup that I was a part of, it was like a flat organization of ICs that somehow all found this, like, same frequency to operate on, and things just worked really well. We were moving very fast. It seemed almost like that there was just an implicit coordination, and we all understood what each other were working on. We all had confidence that that person was going to meet their objectives, and we were able to use those functions.
So, what about the transition to management was hard for you?
The transition to management for me was most difficult in that I didn't want to give up the technical challenges of those technical projects that I was working on. And it's also really difficult to try to translate, especially in like research or in intelligence. If you have some ideas or some general feelings about different experiments you want to try or different data you want to collect to see what's there, and you're really doing a lot of the research oriented tasks, those were the hardest ones for me to give up. But ultimately, the way that I was successful in doing that was really staying a part of it, finding the right balance where I wasn't like micromanaging or really kind of pushing my own like objectives and my own processes on somebody that had their own. And I think that that was the hardest thing to let go of, is like, I really do like a lot of the research challenges, and sometimes just staying out of it is the hardest part for me. But I think it's important that everyone's able to develop their own process and sense of ownership so that they get that reward when, they have their work to show or good research to present. There's a lot of value in having that personal ownership and feeling proud of what you produced, and not have it just feel like you're doing something that's been directed by somebody else. I've been in both positions, both as like as an IC, and that was incredibly difficult for me to deal with when I had, management that really just didn't understand the problems or the objectives, or even couldn't really understand the solution approach that I was presenting. And I think that was probably one of the hardest things I faced as an IC or as an engineer, was knowing that I had the right path to a solution, but not being able to convince somebody else above me that that was the right solution. So now that my role has kind of been reversed, I'm really sensitive to the fact that not everybody is I don't need to understand every approach or, have complete faith that that's going to be successful. It's important to let people try and fail, because that makes the successes much more rewarding, and it makes the failures much more of a learning experience.
How do you select those moments when you're gonna when you're going to let your IC do something that you're pretty sure isn't going to work, but they need to learn that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just part of the field. There's a lot of those cases where, I'm like, "Oh, that's not gonna work," or there's no data exists to prove that, but I've also been proven wrong on a lot of those assumptions. So it's as much of a learning experience for me, and, it's like, "Wow, I'm glad I didn't say that's not gonna work," because that actually worked somehow. I mean, it's, just accepting that and having the team culture that failure is always an option, and recognizing it early, I think, is also very important. We don't want to stay committed to past products or strategies that are flawed. And, just being able to communicate candidly among the team, be like, well, that's screwed up. That's not going to work. And just kind of like make it part of the culture that like, that's totally okay. And, it's just the nature of the beast. I think that if we try to approach this with too much rigor, and we say, well, you have to make this work, or there's no other way that you can do this. You have to do it this way. It sets a bad tone and a bad command climate. And everybody needs their own individual freedom to feel a sense of ownership and responsibility towards the work that they're doing, and own the successes and the failures. And just, I think that a lot of our folks, especially the folks that are in the IC role, they take failures personal enough. They don't need somebody telling them, like, dude, that sucked. Like, that was totally wrong. Can't believe you did that.
They already feel bad enough.
Yeah, they don't need that, So it's really just be like, I think that the more important question is, okay, so what's next? What are we going to try next? Like, let's, just pivot immediately.
What do we learn? Yeah.
Exactly.
Are there any particular trends you're tracking in the space that you think might change how we lead?
Well, the elephant in the room is AI. It's already changed how we work for better and worse. From a security practitioner's perspective, I think that we should all be happy that this new field's emerged for some reinforcement to job security. It also, it's added yet another domain of experts in like another category in this field that, somebody says cybersecurity. It's like, well, what do you actually mean? Cybersecurity. The same thing is true with threat intelligence. Now we have each category. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's reverse engineering, whether it's vulnerability or exploit development, whether it's threat intelligence analysis. Everybody has that new category where there's AI tools available, and we should all be experimenting and failing in those areas because it's brand new. I mean, it's exciting. It's kind of like a resurgence of that, the Wild West again. This is a Wild West, and it's a really good opportunity to forge ahead or become a domain expert in any one of those particular areas, because the playing field has been leveled again. There's a lot of different ways to accelerate your career and experiment with that. I mean, even for reverse engineering, that's a domain that I would say you really have to have a lot of knowledge and deep knowledge in those areas, from whether it's assembly or C or whatever. But now with AI, you don't necessarily need to have all that expert knowledge. It's definitely helpful, and you're going to be much better off if you have it, but it's accessible. Like that, the barrier for entry into any one of these fields has lowered significantly, as long as you're not implicitly trusting everything that your AI is producing.
How does that work though? How do you, as a novice who maybe hasn't done C, hasn't spent much time in assembly, you hand something off to, insert your AI here, ask it to reverse engineer it. How do you interpret those results? How do you know it's not, just making something up?
Yeah, if there's an opportunity to experiment with the things that it's suggesting or the code that it's producing, I think that that's my personal way, is like, let's just try and see what happens. It's like, okay, it's saying that we can, jump this function. Well, implementing some of those things do require some domain expertise and some knowledge there. But again, if you don't know how to do that, you can always, continue the prompt and just, okay, how do I do that? Which instruction do I modify? All those kind of things. There's just a whole new way to enter this field, and using AI as a crutch is going to be a big one.
Any specific traits, skills, qualities that you screen for when hiring for your team?
I look for personal passion. I love to ask people like what their hobbies are. When you're not doing this professionally, what do you do that's kind of closely related? I think that the folks that have, either like, side projects in like software defined radios, or, hardware hacking, or like in the maker community, I really like those personalities. I can identify with them, number one. But also I think it's really cool because there's so much knowledge transfer from those different areas, whether that's electrical engineering or, just making things in general, not even like electronic stuff. I really like the people that are more inclined towards different creative kind of hobbies. And I think that adds a lot of quality to the team, and also like, a little bit of cohesion if everybody has like some similar interests. I don't think it's a hard requirement, but it's definitely helpful.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we've got for today. So before we wrap it up, if people want to follow along with your work, where should they go looking?
Yeah, I mean, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. I'm a pretty prolific poster, and I have a lot of opinions on things. Opinions there are my own, of course, but I think it's one of the best places to kind of check out, whatever I'm thinking about professionally. Please feel free to follow me on LinkedIn.
Thanks for a great conversation, Jeremy. Learned a lot. Let's keep in touch.
Be glad to. Thank you.